$5 all-you-can-eat pancakes are back to celebrate IHOP's 65th anniversary, so come on in.
When Man of Steel was announced, I was a 14-year-old child YouTuber that focused primarily on doing reviews of DC toys. I was pretty excited, so I made my first video that was over an hour long. It was a history of Superman that covered the character's history from conception to 2014 leading up to the Man of Steel movie. When I finally saw the film, I saw it in the theater and I thought it was pretty decent. I didn't quite like it as much as the Christopher Reeves films, which I absolutely loved at that time, but I thought seeing a new take on Superman and Zod was fairly refreshing, and I dug the almost Dark Knight-esque direction they took. I was pretty excited for the ill-fated sequel as well. The development of Man of Steel started in 2008, a couple years after Superman Returns failed to re-establish the character the way Warner Brothers hoped. Interestingly, Warner Bros. Actually started out by looking for ideas within the comic industry, talking to people like Mark Waid, Jeff Johns, and Jim Lee. Ideas included a Superman trilogy that they compared to the Godfather trilogy, with it essentially being an 8-hour epic cut into 3 parts and released yearly. Around this same time, when working on The Dark Knight Rises, David Goyer gave some ideas for Superman to Christopher Nolan, who helped to start the pitching process for Man of Steel as we know it, and would go on to produce the film as well. Several big directors were considered to helm this new version of Superman, including Matt Reeves, Guillermo del Toro, Robert Zemeckis, and Darren Aronofsky, before finally settling on Zach Snyder. My speculation his hiring was in part due to the connection he has with Warner Brothers, given that he produced 2 other DC adaptations, Watchmen and 300 previously, which were popular and started to make Zack Snyder a household name, especially among comic book and action movie fans. The movie was designed to have some very on-the-nose themes, with Superman being compared to Jesus and Zod Hitler with his Kryptonian eugenics ideology. Do these allegories add up in the film or really have any place in a Superman film? I don't know, perhaps. Anyways, that's the background of Man of Steel. Let me peel back the layers and take a deeper look. The story of Man of Steel is based on multiple eras of Superman's life and is a pretty hard origin story. Shortly after Kal-El's birth, a war broke out on Krypton due to the world's imminent collapse. Zod betrays the Kryptonian Council and kills Jor-El, and then is subsequently sent to the Phantom Zone with several of his co-conspirators. It is too late, however, the planet is doomed, and in a last-ditch effort to preserve something from Krypton, Kal-El is sent to Earth, seemingly the last person in the Kryptonian race. As time goes on, Kal comes to Earth and is named Clark Kent to better adapt to humans. Clark has a hard time finding a place in the world at first, traveling and working odd jobs, not sure if he should be the hero his compulsion tells him to be, or stay hidden the way his parents taught him. Eventually, his hand is forced when General Zod returns after escaping the Phantom Zone with the powerful Black Zero machine, which he hopes to use to change the atmosphere of Earth to be more like Krypton. Meanwhile, Clark's cells also held a DNA codec that could create a new breed of Kryptonians. Clark then embraces his destiny and becomes Superman, ultimately being forced to choose to sacrifice what's left of his people for the good of the human race and ultimately defeating Zod and stopping his plot against Earth. I'll go more into the characters that are featured's comic book backgrounds in a bit, but at this point I want to break down the motivations of all the primary characters and tell you my thoughts. Superman's journey throughout the film is that of self-reflection and a decision on where to take his future. However, at times he feels a bit passive and directionless, with his ultimate decision to become Superman being forced by the appearance of Zod. That's not necessarily a criticism, but it makes his choice to change into a hero a bit subtle. The voices opposing this change being his father Jonathan, and the voices towards his transition into becoming a hero primarily being Jor-El's projection on his spaceship. I think Jonathan Kent is probably the weakest character in the film, and while I understand he hopes to hide Clark's abilities and stuff, they just have him rattle off philosophical nonsense. It also doesn't really weigh on Clark's decision to pick up the cape. Ultimately, Jonathan's sacrifice seems pretty pointless and rushed. It also seems a bit out of character. Superman likes helping people because it's his responsibility. I think it would have been more poignant if he had a conversation with his father and explained the world needed him instead of just crying while his dad spouts nonsense. I think we needed to see more out of him and his reasonings for the things he did. The film definitely could have moved more time into this character, especially with how bloated the Krypton stuff felt at the beginning, being 20 minutes of the film that for some reason is recapped to the audience in 30 seconds around 30 minutes after we saw those events unfold originally in front of us. Clark often lacks much personality or character, being pretty quiet. And while honestly, Cavill looks great as Superman, when he's talking, I don't think he's that great in the film. We should also probably discuss Superman and religion, a real half-baked theme that keeps rearing its ugly head in this film. Zach clearly intended to make Superman Space Jesus, which is fine if it made any sense. Yes, he's the last son of a dying planet, but other than that, Superman should be a relatively regular guy, thus integrating better with the world and explaining why he does what he does. When Superman first appeared in the late 30s, he primarily fought corrupt landlords and politicians. He wasn't dying for the sins of man. He was a dude that had extra powers he was using to stand up for the little guy. Zach has Kal be the first Kryptonian born naturally in centuries. I don't get that. You're telling me Kryptonians don't get freaky and have accident babies? How has not one other baby been accidentally birthed on an entire planet in literally centuries? If there's some form of genital mutilation that takes place, why was Jor-El and Laura not mutilated genitally? And it makes no logical sense. I hate it. And don't worry, none of the future films expand on this idea either. Also, somehow the whole genetic code was grafted to Superman's cells, and he has the key to Kryptonian's revival, again making him Kryptonian Jesus. I just don't get Zach's fascination with it, and I think it's stupid. Also, Superman at one point goes to church and is like praying with a pastor. He won't shut up about God and stuff. I have no problem with characters having some religious beliefs if it's cooked into the character. Think Marvel's Daredevil. But Superman isn't a religious character. His creators were Jewish, which makes no sense that now he's an incredibly Catholic character, but also never really baked anything particularly Jewish into Superman's character and used him as a power fantasy that stands up for the little guy and the oppressed. But Superman is meant to be a universal hero. Anyone should feel like they can relate to Superman, and anyone should be able to have the Superman fantasy. I think stripping him away from being a POV character into this more religious higher power makes him way less relatable than he was in his early iterations, and is sort of a huge fundamental flaw with the film and its philosophy, especially since these themes weren't really followed up on in any meaningful way in the following two films. Regardless, Lois Lane is pretty proactive in this film and pretty quickly unravels the mystery of Superman. In the comics it took a long time, not officially knowing until the 80s when they decided to make the characters get married. I think this is a positive change since Lois at times felt a little shallow chasing around Superman in the comics, and while she was proactive, she occasionally came off as the airheaded woman stereotype in the comics, with her just doing blatantly dumb things in an attempt to get more face time with Superman. In this more serious and grounded world, with a tremendous talent behind the character, it feels perhaps more fitting to have her figure out pretty quickly who Superman is. I think it also allows for a more humanistic reason for Lois and Superman to ultimately fall in love, because she isn't actively rejecting Clark for the reason that he isn't as much of a Chad as Superman, only to later fall in love with Clark when she finds out he's Superman. I think it works better for this version of the character, and while I understand in the comics it's integral to her character for a long time to kind of try to discover Superman with him one-upping her, in a more modern film I don't think it works as well, and I think there's a solid reason for about half of Superman's history up to this point. Lois is known in some form that Superman was Clark. Jor-El is more essential in this film than your typical Superman story. The first 20 minutes of this film, which arguably could have been cut, at least adds a pretty solid Russell Crowe performance. Jor-El knows from the start of the film that Krypton is fucked, and he plans to encode the DNA of all Kryptonians into Kal's cells and send them to Earth, which is hampered by this large civil war taking place on Krypton. The only thing I don't understand about his master plan is why he encoded his son with the Kryptonian DNA when he knows the revival of Kryptonians would spell the end of the human race, as his hologram implies in the film. I don't really understand why he would do this, besides the potential drama added to the plot when General Zod tries to kill Superman to get the code. General Zod is actually a pretty good villain. He's your average space Hitler, which isn't really anything new, but you actually sense a real motivation for what he's doing. He has a chance to bring back Krypton, and he will do it no matter what, even if it takes killing humanity. While he also wants to see Krypton politically follow him, he has a strange love for his people and wants to see them return to their former glory. We also get a lot of scenes that show his motivation, and I'd say he's a more solid villain than most superhero films have. He's definitely a horrible person, but you understand what would lead him to follow this path for the most part. It feels like something that would realistically happen based on the sequence of events. If he fled his dying planet he fought for, especially given that he saw the Council on Krypton politically inadequate and blames them for the demise of Krypton, which, despite his desperate attempts, he failed to stop. He couldn't give a shit about humans because of his colonial beliefs that Kryptonians are superior and deserve to thrive over a weaker race. You know, like every imperial government ever. He's essentially Superman's Napoleon. It's actually some commentary that worked pretty well, if that's what they were going for. And I think the film should have focused more on Zod and less on Superman being Space Jesus, because Zod is really solid in the film and really steals the show. The film looks pretty good for the most part, at least it looks pretty unique. Most superhero films of the last 10 years have had the superhero movie look that I think really took off after Joss Whedon made The Avengers, which is perhaps the most boring looking superhero film of all time. I'm not saying by any means it's the worst looking, but the regulation of cinematography to make them all look like they take place in the same world has been a plague to the superhero genre. The house-style cinematography doesn't look terrible per se, but it makes a rewatch of something like Man of Steel a little more satisfying, since it looks more like a film in its own right, with even some great superhero films that don't really bother to make good cinematography to go with them. Granted, the film's cinematography and general feel could be described as Michael Bay meets late-era Ridley Scott, but it's still refreshing to see when compared to the house style of many other superhero films. Tonally, the film is fairly confused at points, and I think a lot of that comes down to Cavill and how Superman is written. Half the time, Superman just watches stuff happen with a blank expression, shaped almost entirely by the characters that surround him. So one moment, it feels like Superman is a beacon of hope when he's around Martha. Then he's sad and depressed when he's with his father. Then in the next moment, he meets Jor-El's hologram thing on a spaceship, and it's kinda whimsical. When he's around Zod, he goes emo and reluctantly breaks Zod's neck, which I know people hate, but it kind of makes sense in the context of the world since, how are they going to imprison this crazy homicidal General Zod who literally wants to destroy the world and they have no means of containing him or killing him? Seems like that would bring up some logistical problems. Plus, Zod was like, kill me or I'll slaughter these civilians. It was the only way to stop Zod's onslaught, so I understand why he did it. It also weighed on Superman, and his grief in killing the only other link to his heritage comes through in one of Cavill's only decent moments in the film. The editing in this film, for the most part, works. The only part that really gets to me is when they hard switch from a straight origin story to an alien invasion story. For some reason, Zod requests the humans give up Superman via TV, or the invasion would begin. Well, for one, why the hell would they hack every screen in the world to do this? They know specifically that humans are much weaker compared to Superman. How are they going to get Superman? Superman also hasn't revealed himself as a hero yet, so the world doesn't know who he is, so everyone's probably like, who the fuck is this guy? It would make more sense if the government knew Superman, but alas, whatever. The moment happens, and then comes the most tonal whiplash I've ever received. From here, it feels like, okay, this is a totally different movie now. It regains its legs pretty quickly, but from there it's pretty much basic non-stop action, and a lot of the character moments and themes that Zach Snyder were trying to set up kind of go out the window in favor of Superman punches stuff. From here I'm going to talk about the characters and where they were adapted from. I'm going to do this in every part because I like talking about comic books and other media related to these characters, so bear with me. Superman's first appearance is Action Comics #1, his original creators being Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. This is their second attempt to make a character called Superman, however, the original being a villain who was a telepath in a short story called Reign of the Superman, which interestingly would inspire the name of Dan Jurgens' story, Reign of the Supermen, which was kind of a sequel to The Death of Superman. His basic origin is that he is a baby on a dying planet called Krypton and was sent to Earth to eventually become Superman. Superman went through a lot of variations over the years, with the Man of Steel version of the character not particularly following any previous adaptations of the character, obviously taking elements from Superman here and there, but unlike a Superman adaptation like Christopher Reeve's take from the 70s and 80s, which drew heavily from the 60s and 70s version of Superman, it's pretty clear this version of Superman didn't have much of a blueprint. The only one that's kind of similar is the New 52, where they made him a little darker and changed up his suit to be somewhat reminiscent of what Superman was wearing in this film, but based on the time it probably took to make this film, I suspect this film was already in production, and this general aesthetic was planned to carry over into both the comics and the film world. That version of Superman, the more edgy New 52 one, would eventually merge with his pre-52 self and become more of the status quo Superman that we all know. So, comics get really confusing. I'm not going to explain stuff as much as I probably should, because to me it all makes sense. So you'll just have to deal with that sometimes. But Superman merges with other Superman and becomes the Superman. So, Man of Steel ties kind of directly into the creation of the New 52 Superman, I speculate, at least to some extent. And this kind of cross-pollination between media and comics is fairly common, with the radio show from the late 40s and 50s adding kryptonite as well as Superman's ability to fly in the comics, which didn't appear in his earliest adaptations. General Zod, or Drew Zod, first appeared in Adventure Comics 283 as an adversary of Superboy. He was a pretty minor character in his first appearance, but later his role would expand and he'd become a more common threat as part of Superman's rogues gallery, especially following Superman 2. This is another case of comics and media kind of cross-pollinating to create a bigger character. I'm guessing Zod was chosen for this film probably mostly due to his cultural impact from the version we saw in Richard Lester's Superman 2. With this character having fairly similar ambitions to that of the character in Superman 2, that being to kind of track down Superman and defeat him, to take over the world. Of course, this one kind of has the eugenics themes and DNA coding to create new Supermen theme, but you know what? The idea is there, and my point is, stuff will get pulled from the comics back into the movies, and back and forth. But anyways, Laura Larvon, the wife of Jor-El and the mother of Superman, first appeared in the Superman newspaper strip. For a while during the 30s and 40s, Superman had a tie-in news strip that had art and was written by the series creators Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel. In the movie, Laura doesn't do a ton in the Krypton segments, with the Krypton sequences mostly being spearheaded by Jor-El. Jor-El is pretty much a secondary lead of this film, and is very essential to the story in this film. He also originated in a newspaper strip before coming to the mainline comics, at one point even being portrayed by Marlon Brando, who made the character much more popular given his massive star power when Richard Donner casted him for the original Superman film. He's the father of Superman and a top scientist on Krypton that, along with his wife, jettisons his infant son in order to save his life. Lois Lane first appeared in Action Comics #1 along with Superman and was always Clark Kent's primary love interest. I like Amy Adams in the role. She doesn't particularly look anything like Lois, but who cares? She has the attitude, and as a proactive reporter who is interested in Superman and puts herself in reasonable danger, risking her life to unravel the mystery of who is this Superman. It is in contrast to Margot Kidder, who is also pretty iconic in the role, and had more of the attitudes of the 60s Lois Lane, jumping off buildings in order to test her Superman theories, which, while I suppose is dangerous and proactive in a way, is also more stupid, and she seems more obsessed with Superman in he's a hunky guy kind of way, than actually trying to unravel the story first and foremost like Amy Adams did. Perry White's first appearance was in the radio series from the 40s, in the second episode called Clark Kent Reporter, and he later folded into the comics several months later in Superman issue 7. I really like Lawrence Fishburne's take on the character. He's kind of a grumpy hard-ass that ultimately loves the story his papers tell and will give his reporters a hard time in order to push for greatness from his paper. I thought he was great casting overall, even if his role is somewhat minor in the film. Musically, the score isn't bad. I actually found myself humming it for a bit after the most recent rewatch, which is good. Hans Zimmer did a pretty good job, and since they fully ditched the iconic John Williams Superman score for something new, they needed to come with some heat for the film to deliver a score that could stand up to that original iconic score. The film lacks an end credits scene, and this is kind of refreshing to me, since lately superhero end credits scenes feel less like hype for what's next, and more a horrible headache designed to make the world even more confused by the plot lines that may or may not pay off. DC is incredibly guilty of this, which we'll get into later, but I think of other classic end credit scenes that have seemingly gone nowhere in the last few years, like Harry Styles as Star Fox at the end of Eternals, or Charlize Theron as Cleo at the end of Doctor Strange. These days, I normally skip the end credits scenes because they usually leave me disappointed, and generally I'd rather release my bladder than watch the end credits scenes that I don't really care about. But for this video, we're going to talk about any end credits scenes and whether or not they actually led to anything, or my opinions on it if it's just like a goofy end scene. From here I want to talk primarily about the things I liked and disliked about the films, ones that don't really fit into my larger critiques, and we'll start with the good. One thing I really wanted to highlight is the world building. Krypton especially looks pretty cool, and the technology is pretty unique from our own. I think it's pretty realistic that this world in its twilight would get in a violent war because I think humans would do the exact same thing if faced with certain destruction. The idea of a political divide between a band of rebels and the Kryptonian Council is interesting, and ultimately, it feels like it was everyone's fault that Krypton died, which is part of the reason Superman ultimately sides with humanity at the end of the movie, as he sees humanity as still having a chance to have a better tomorrow, and perhaps learn from the mistakes of Krypton. I think in general, the fights are also pretty standout and creative, and they look pretty good. Zach and his team clearly put a lot of work into storyboarding every aspect of each fight, so there's a lot of unique little sequences and actions throughout each set piece that seem to have taken a lot of work. Another great set piece was on Zod's ship when the hologram of Jor-El is using his control of the ship to close doors and open stuff, allowing Lois to escape. That scene was fun and actually had a lot of energy, which I think sometimes, especially in the later films, Zach Snyder somewhat lacks. I also like the imagery when Superman is tripping out on Kryptonian gravity, and this somehow lets Zod invade his mind, and they have a philosophical battle while Superman is on a pile of skulls. Did it make much sense? No, not really, but it was cool. Finally, the movie has more human moments, attempting to grapple with Clark's humanity, which, despite having mixed results and being a bit confused at points, was at least an attempt, since it seemed like a really easy theme for superhero films to grapple with, yet they rarely actually do. We also see some of the disastrous effects of the Black Zero up close, which shows people suffering. It's kind of depressing, and I think for better or worse, in the escapist superhero genre, it's rarely touched on. And using imagery pulled straight from Ground Zero of the World Trade Center attack for your Superman film can only be described as bold and possibly distasteful. But I kind of like the scene where Perry White's trying to save Jenny after she gets stuck under a bunch of rubble. It's also a pretty good character moment for a character I thought was somewhat underutilized in the film as well, and unfortunately underutilized going forward in this universe. Even though there's some merit to Man of Steel, it has a lot of issues. I mentioned this earlier, but for better or for worse, this movie feels like a Ridley Scott movie mixed with a Michael Bay movie. What I mean by that is that it has a lot of style, and it doesn't look bad, but it's a bit shallow for a lot of the films, and it gets a little convoluted trying to tie together a bunch of lore that isn't always super well thought out. There are also moments like when the female soldier calls Superman hot.
What are you smiling about, Captain?
Nothing, sir. I just think he's kind of hot.
That feels incredibly stupid and crowd-pleasing, like a lot of Michael Bay films.
I am directly below the enemy scrotum.
Zach Snyder isn't particularly a crowd-pleasing director, and feels like a mix of someone who wants to ooze style but also make dumb movies. And there's nothing wrong with either approach, but combining them can be a fatal recipe, as we see with the subsequent Snyder films, and also feels like a kind of common trope of the more modern Ridley Scott movies. I'm thinking of You, Napoleon. You know what else really grinded my gears? This is kind of a nitpick, but when Jor-El explains for 5 minutes to Superman exactly what happened for the first 20 minutes of the film, why would they do that? Like, we saw this. Why are we getting this exposition dump on what we saw for the first 20 minutes of the film? Like, it thinks we're so dumb we need further explanation? Or, like, a review of what happened in the first 20 minutes after an additional 30 minutes had passed? Like, it hadn't been that long. I still remember what happened. This isn't like a 6-hour movie. The scene gets a little more awkward when this capsule opens up and reveals Superman's perfectly crafted supersuit. Who the fuck made that? This ship is supposed to be like 20,000 years old, and there's just this perfectly crafted and tailored supersuit in there with the House of Al emblem on it. That was kind of odd. The film has some bad product placement too, like it's everywhere. The Smallville fight is like a huge billboard. We had 7-Eleven, U-Haul, Sears, and we even have Lois Lane interview a man in a full IHOP uniform. Also, Kevin Costner's bad in this movie and seems kind of drunk. Like, every line he has is supposed to be some wise shit, but then it makes no sense, and he just kind of mumbles it off, and he comes off genuinely intoxicated. I like Kevin Costner, but you can tell he didn't give a shit about this movie. Pretty much any profound dialogue from the Kents comes off as totally forced and weird, like when Martha said some shit about making the world small and all that. I just never got a sense they were actually wise because they were saying some of the dumbest shit I've ever heard. Also, Zod's plan is kind of messy at times. For one, why did he park the Black Zero right above Metropolis and not over like the ocean or something, or the North Pole, or somewhere where he would be kind of hidden, or wouldn't have huge amounts of human resistance? I know the humans are weak compared to him, but at least the human fighter jets were acting as like a distraction and helping blow up some of those little side ships he had with the other pirates on it. But he's in America, which at this point he knows Superman is located in. And he parks over the heart of a major city, and he knows his powers, so he knows Superman's powers, so he should know that Superman can just pull up. Like, I just don't understand why he would park it right over Metropolis, other than that would be a way for Zach Snyder to bring in his 9/11 imagery, which I know he really wanted to do. And you also have to think, like, if the Black Zero machine is this super powerful force that can change the gravitational pull of a planet and make it more like Krypton, so it's inhabitable for the Kryptonians, or better inhabitable for the Kryptonians, I should say, how come when they ran the machine for, like, however the fuck long, did that not cause, like, extinction level climate change to the world? When it turns off, it doesn't just reset back to normal. Why would it do that? So I don't really understand that. And then if Zod's plan comes to fruition and he makes all of these genetic code babies that are in Superman's DNA, he's got like a team of like 20 people. How is he going to take care of all those babies and form a new civilization for Krypton? Those kids would die. They'd get hungry and they would die. Even if they were in those little like birthing pods. Like, you think like when they leave the birthing pod they gotta learn shit. I don't know, man. Doesn't make sense to me. Where's he gonna get the birthing lake? From Krypton? Whatever. Also, for better or for worse, the first 2/3 of this film was covered in literally 3 panels in Action Comics #1, which makes me giggle a little bit, though it's fitting for the DCEU to start the same way the comic universe started with the destruction of Krypton. So, I get it, you're trying to expand the story and kind of give us something new. Okay, but to put all my thoughts on Man of Steel in one paragraph and break it down, my verdict on the film is that it's okay. It has a lot of things that really impressed me and a lot of messy elements. I think it had a lot of potential and worked for the most part, with a lot of the actors putting a lot into their roles, such as Amy Adams, Lawrence Fishburne, Russell Crowe, Michael Shannon, and Diane Lane, all being standouts. Kevin Costner felt pretty phoned in, and Henry Cavill felt a bit in over his head, with him also seeming a bit confused about what angle to take this character in, because between scenes, Superman shifts dramatically in mood and ideology. The screenplay was pretty bloated, and while I didn't love every idea that it had, at least they tried to make something fitting of an epic. And besides the awkward editing moment with Zod's TV announcements, the editing felt pretty coherent, and most of the flashbacks and stuff were tied in pretty well. So overall, I passively like this movie. I think it's fine. I have critiques, but it's not the worst thing I've ever seen, and compared to a lot of what comes out in the DCEU later, I think this was kind of a high point for the universe. Not the high point, but a high point. It's fine. Man of Steel made $688 million against a budget of $250 million. With marketing, that means it probably made like $200 to $300 million, which isn't a terrible box office haul, and led to them greenlighting Zack Snyder's next project, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film ended up with a critic score of 56%, with a lot of critics praising the action but complaining that the film fell a bit too heavily into the action cliches of the day. Metacritic had a 55 out of 100, which is a similar score to Rotten Tomatoes, which doesn't always happen because the film grading between Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic is substantially different. Metacritic going based on critic average to create an average score, and Rotten Tomatoes going with whether or not the film review was considered positive. There were other critics that complained that the film stripped a lot of joy from the Superman character, with not much covered in terms of new ground on the screen when compared to the previous 5 Superman entries. Comics creators were equally mixed on the project, with Dan Jurgens, one of the most iconic modern Superman authors, thinking the movie was great, while Mark Waid, who worked on the character a lot as well, was a little more negative on it. Waid said the film felt joyless, which he felt betrayed the character. Where other iconic creatives like Grant Morrison and Neil Adams were a little torn on the movie and felt Superman killings fundamentally went against the character's spirit. I really respect these artists and writers' works, and I know their impact on the character's history, so it's kind of interesting hearing what they have to say on this movie, which, clearly by the critical response, has a fairly mixed reaction. Man of Steel didn't exactly blow up the award shows either, with the Best Award coming from New Now Next Awards, which gave the award for Must-See Summer Movie, before the film even released. However, Henry Cavill got another award nomination at that same awards ceremony, being nominated for the coveted 'Cause You're Hot award at the same ceremony, but ultimately being beaten out. Overall, based on the critical and commercial reception of Man of Steel, a sequel was planned that eventually became Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice.